Well, welcome to this webinar. There's never a dull moment in security affairs, especially in the middle of one of the most awful wars which the continent has experienced since 1945. But there's also never a dull moment in British politics, is there? So that's why we're especially grateful that James Heappey MP, who was promoted to Minister of the Armed Forces in July, but has spent a number of years now in the MOD, is able to be with us today. James is the Member of Parliament for Wells and Somerset, but before his parliamentary career, he was an officer in the British Army from 2004 to 2012, leaving as a major with the rank of major. And of course, those were some of the most busy years for the British Army and still, of course, affect the way in which we look at defence affairs in the very different world we have today. And Minister Rui, your contribution is the culmination of a trilateral discussion we've been having over the last couple of days with think tank counterparts in Norway and the United States, an initiative which reflects the close links between our three countries. And I think you will agree that the current crisis shows once again how important the shared interests of Norway, the United Kingdom and the United States are, and some of the discussions about escalation very much link into that. And I'm especially grateful also that the Norwegian ambassador has found time to be with us today and will be speaking in the panel that follows your contribution. Our title today is about our shared security priorities following Russia's war in Ukraine. But of course, we all know that that war is still going on and indeed, in some important respects, is intensifying. But if there is a consistent lesson from previous major wars, it's a need to at least begin to think about what follows, despite all the uncertainty about the outcome. We all know that the future of European security will depend in large measure on the war's outcome, but we also know that the war objectives today are being set in part with an eye on what we are trying to achieve at that end of the conflict when that comes. So we're really looking forward to your remarks. After your presentation, I hope we have a little bit of time for questions, both from the webosphere as well as from the people in the room. Hopefully you'll keep your mobile phone turned off during that, Minister, so that you're not unduly distracted by events in the wider political sphere. So, Minister, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much indeed. And it absolutely terrifies the MOD civil service when you turn up with just that. But I guess this is one of two things. It's either a sort of valedictory reflection on nearly 3 years in the MOD, in which case, fill your boots, or it's some reflections on where I think my inbox is at on the back of nearly 3 years in the job, 2.5 as MINAF, 60 plus countries visited, and the interesting bit about my job is that sometimes Ben needs me to deputize for the things that he is focused on, so around the Euro-Atlantic. On other times, he just needs me watching his back on the stuff that is going on in the broader world. And that positions you to sort of see, I think, at times, the interconnectedness between what's going on in the wider world against the immediate point of confrontation. So look, a statement of the blinking obvious, and then three big lessons from my perspective. So the statement of the blinking obvious is that we have inescapably returned to a requirement for conventional hard power deterrence. There is, and I think that we've been on a bit of a journey, and I think that some wrongly interpreted the previous IR and the integrated operating concept as a view that you could get upstream of all problems through operating, that the challenge was to have capability that defended against sub-threshold threats, And I think what that ignores is that the deterrence against going sub-threshold in the first place is a conventional response that you don't want. You know, you sort of, if you can guarantee that an attack on CNI brings with it a hard power consequence, that makes the attack on CNI less clever, because it's not sub-threshold. You've been very clear that an attack on CNI is above the threshold. So there's a sort of thing about getting back into the business of recognizing that raw hard power is deterrence, and that a strategic deterrence only really deters against a strategic attack, and that everything that is sub-strategic really relies on a conventional hard power. NATO's got that. Our main allies in Europe and North America have got that. And you can see all across the alliance, people realizing that it's time to retool up and be in the business as an alliance of being able to overwhelm militarily. That's not to say that all of the sub-threshold stuff doesn't exist. We're seeing it right now in Ukraine with the mining of a dam to give leverage over a civilian population as a piece of and the fact that it is a piece of CNI in its own right. We are seeing the targeting of civilian electrical grid infrastructure, and you've got to be able to guard against that stuff. You've got to be able to harden it. You need to be building your critical national infrastructure in such a way that anticipates that it might be attacked. But that wider resilience as part of the defense of your homeland doesn't excuse the requirement for a hard deterrence in its own right. And that's the opening point I make. But I think it's a statement of the bleeding obvious after what we've seen in the last few months. 3 lessons. The first is Ukraine's edge, beyond the fact that it is clearly winning when it comes to the moral component. The Ukrainians, facing an existential threat, are motivated and brave and committed in a way that the Russian armed forces have proven not to be, because they thought they were going on a special operation with no real anticipation of what was to come. But beyond that, it's about Ukraine's strategic depth. It's about the fact that the world beyond has given Ukraine a strategic depth. It's about the industrial capacity that has existed across NATO, across the West, across its allies beyond, that have been able to get Ukraine into the fight, sustain Ukraine in the fight, and help Ukraine to match Russian escalation so that Ukraine has been able to remain competitive and successful throughout all of this. Now, that's all fine when the world beyond Ukraine is not in the conflict. But I think there are some really hard realities that we have been forced to learn when you say, here you go, Ukraine, take our stocks of this missile system or these artillery shells or these vehicles. And then you go to industry in the UK and say, and now we want to replace them because the Treasury very kindly have done us a new for old deal, which is awesome. But then you find that the industrial capacity simply does not exist to replace those things at anything like the pace that would be required. And given that the whole model of NATO deterrence is that NATO as an alliance holds forces of sufficient mass to respond to a crisis, and we have assumptions about how long we need to be able to respond to that crisis for, with existing stockpiles, in anticipation of industry coming into gear behind us in order to sustain thereafter, it's very obvious stockpiles that were being held across NATO, even in the US, were insufficient given realistically how long it would take for manufacturing to come in. That is made all the harder by the fact that in the Second World War, it might have taken 6 months, a year, for a civilian plane factory to become a Spitfire factory, or for a locomotive factory to become a tank factory. But when you have offshored all of your domestic manufacturing to a part of the world that is a very precarious sea line of communication away, or might just be in the hands of a country that you regard increasingly as a competitor, you start to see that you don't quite have the industrial base with which to do a war of national survival and best effort. So that leads, I think, to some really profound challenges, not just to the MOD, but to government as a whole here in the UK and in every other Western country about what is the consequence of the changed manufacturing landscape since we were last in a state of total war. And is there even enough industry to repurpose at time of total war to sustain a war effort? Or actually you're going to be in the business of not only repurposing factories, but building factories anew, and is that even a realistic prospect? And if it's not, how do you deliver for yourself that strategic depth that can give you confidence? Not that you need a defense industry standing right now that can do it all straight away. That's an unrealistic proposition given the size of the force that we all realistically need within NATO. But within your industrial strategy, you surely need to understand that there is some industrial latency that you can turn to for defense purposes that is otherwise servicing your domestic manufacturing requirements. The other bit is how you maintain your technological advantage, because for all of the chat about hard power, that is not some sort of romantic view that as long as we dust down all of the Challenger 1s and Chieftains that are currently gate guards in every camp around Tidworth and give them a bit of a service and get them back into service, we can kid ourselves we've got 200 extra tanks. That's nonsense. They'd be defeated in a blink. And I wouldn't want to be, frankly, in a modern main battle tank on the battle space in Ukraine, because the missile technology is in the ascendancy. Now, I'm sure that defense industry will innovate to level the playing field sooner rather than later. So I'm not advertising the death of the main battle tank, far from it. But so rapid is that technological game of cat and mouse that maintaining technological advantage is really hard, especially if you only seek to maintain technological advantage through the work of your big primes. I actually think there's a real lesson from all of this in the way that the Ukrainians, and it is maddening when you find it, but I rock up on Salisbury Plain to see the army doing a sort of, hey, minister, this is what the future of the UAV warfare thing looks like. This is our kind of 5-year horizon. And what you find when you walk around the stands is that there's a company in Wiltshire who got an email from Kyiv 2 days beforehand saying, hey, we've Googled you. We think what you do is great. We're going to send you all of the bandwidth details for how Russian EW is working, because we want you to quickly spiral your product into such a way that it will be able to have effect in Ukraine from 2 weeks' time. And as soon as Russia has changed its EW capability, we'll come back to you and see what you can do next. And so that speed, that connection between the intelligence you gather and the speed with which you share it with industry and the speed at which you innovate, that broadens your industrial base, because you can bring small innovators into a defense space in a way that we traditionally have not when we're making big programmatic decisions very deliberately over time. And I'm quite excited by doing that, providing we in defense can have the confidence to see that our procurement processes are all designed around dealing with big primes. And we are far too cautious about sharing the battlefield intelligence that we have for the purposes of quickly spiraling tech. Now, maybe if we're in the same case as Ukraine, where they've been willing to share that information because they're facing an existential threat, so why not? We would do the same. But actually, why can't we do that in peacetime? Why aren't we more trusting of industry and innovators to get on and innovate? Second lesson, and this is not going to be 10 minutes, I apologize. Second lesson is the absolute essential nature of the competition for narratives. Because you can be on the side of the angels, you can behave impeccably, you can check and check and check again before you do anything in terms of your support for a country like Ukraine. But if the other side gains the initiative in the battle for narratives, you are on the back foot. You're constantly justifying your actions. Now, I genuinely think that we surprised Putin and those around him back in February by the way that the West was willing to take risk against highly sensitive intelligence in order to get ahead on the battle of narratives. Think back to the chemical weapon dirty bomb false flag that was emerging back in January. I heard about that on a Friday evening at Top Secret Strat 3, our most secret level of intelligence. On the Sunday, I flew to New York. I spent the Monday in the UN, and by the time I got to Washington on the Monday night, the ambassador was telling me that the Pentagon had briefed that piece of intelligence directly to the Washington Post or New York Times, I can't remember which, to call out the false flag, to get ahead of it, because it was clearly the pretext for what Russia was shaping to do. Now, I don't think Putin expected us to play in that game at all. The speed at which the Western Alliance came together, the speed at which, even though this has never been a NATO thing, but the speed at which NATO allies understood the threat, rallied to deter within NATO and to communicate their intent to deter within NATO, and then came together as a separate grouping to support Ukraine and were clear in that separation. Putin was never given the opportunity to create the narrative that we were the aggressor. He was never given the opportunity to create the narrative that NATO was expansionist and had designs on Ukraine, because we were quick to get ahead of him. We declassified intelligence to call out false flags. And the one bit that I think we might have got slightly wrong, and again, this comes from my travels beyond the Euro-Atlantic, because in Europe, the consensus was there and it was straight away. And we surprised ourselves, I think, at the speed at which sanctions came in and the speed at which everybody was resolved to support Ukraine. And so you can very quickly tell yourself that the world thinks the same. And the initial Unger votes actually kind of indicated that that was the case. But when you go down into Central Africa, into the Caribbean, into Latin America, into the South Pacific, what you find is that there is a subtly alternative narrative that isn't seeking to say this is all Europe's fault, this is all America's fault. It's just saying, you guys are suffering, aren't you, because of the way that the Europeans are all piling in what should have been a private dispute between Russia and Ukraine. Look how your food prices are going. Look at the political stability in your country. As a consequence, that was never anything that a UK minister could say over the last year about political stability, but everybody else could. And it was striking. It was striking that it wasn't self-evident that we were on the side of right and Russia was on the side of wrong, because they had got themselves out into the world beyond and communicated very clearly an alternative narrative that planted enough of a seed that actually you start to just get the thing of all we care about is that this is over. Just get it over and done with. It's destabilizing. It's driving up cost of living challenges. It's threatening us. We've got bigger things to worry about. Stop it. And we have to be careful, because that sort of sentiment starts to undermine a rules-based international system. And we believe in a rules-based international. The big prize in all of this is not only the restoration of Ukrainian territory, it is a re-underlining of the centrality of a rules-based international system to the way in which the world does its business. And actually, if we lose the narrative, and this segues to where I'm going next, if you follow the ball, like my son's mighty Cheddar under-10 team, where everybody was within about 10 yards of the ball, you miss that in the pitch beyond, there's a whole lot of space in which people cause mischief. And actually, this century is about a competition between the US and China. Nobody knows quite how that competition plays out, but really that's the arc of things. That's the binary thing that reflects a competition between Western liberal democracy and Chinese style autocracy and authoritarianism. And we should not take for granted that the argument for freedom, sovereignty, territorial integrity, democracy is irreversibly won. There are plenty of places in the world where the Chinese view of the world is quite persuasive. There are plenty of places in the world where our highly nuanced bilateral conversations where we say, well, we will help you with that export contract that you're really keen to secure, but we just need you to do this, and this first, because we find that quite challenging. And when you do deal with China, there's no such qualifications offered. In fact, the only thing offered beyond the platform is a finance deal to help you afford it. And we have to be really careful not to let the perfect be the enemy of the good in the way that we do business in the world beyond, because what we will find, I fear, is that having been forced into 2, 3, 4, 5 years, however long Ukraine goes on, where everything has been about a focus on the Euro-Atlantic and our immediate security concerns here in Europe, that we might then come out of the cave and look at the world beyond and see that our spheres have been challenged to such a degree in the meantime, that China has effectively won the argument about how a global system should operate, how the global economy should operate. And, the US is superseded, not just economically, which I think is kind of an inevitability, but the values that have underpinned the post-war world and that we thought had triumphed, and we believe it. We know them to be the best way of running our countries, of running the world, have been challenged to such a degree that we really have got to a place where the world is divided. And there are practical parts of that too, that mean that this isn't just something to worry about in 20 or 30 or 40 years' time, and it's not just ideological. The patience of China's Belt and Road Initiative over 20 years to build the infrastructure and secure the rights to the raw materials that will probably make you sovereign in 2040 or 2050. If in the wars of the industrial age, it was about steel and oil, in the wars of the digital age, it's about rare earths and microprocessors. And there is this real danger that already we have handed such an advantage to China that lots of NATO, European, North American countries already would struggle to really say that they are sovereign when it comes to their capacity to manufacture the technologies that are essential to defense capabilities in the middle of the decade. So a return to conventional deterrence, easy, but needs to be said nonetheless. But really the three key takeaways are how essential it is to have strategic depth and a manufacturing capacity within the alliance that, even if not geared towards defense always, is there to be converted to defense purposes in a time of total war. And the necessity to have a science-led technological edge that is informed by intelligence and getting that spiral loop going quickly. Secondly, that it's not just about the kit, it's about the narratives, it's about the politics, it's about the diplomacy. Take nothing for granted that white is white and black is black when it comes to how people view right and wrong on a global scale. And thirdly, eyes up. Remember that the competition that really defines this century is not what's happening in Ukraine right now, although what happens in Ukraine right now absolutely sends a message about how this competition over the remainder of the century will play out. But remember that what's really at stake is a competition between authoritarianism and liberal democracy. And we've got to be out there every day, everywhere, competing in order to make that case. Otherwise, we risk winning the battle here in the Euro-Atlantic, only to find that we've lost the wider competition that should have defined this century. Thank you all very much indeed.
Minister, you have a little bit of time for questions, I hope.
Have I been sacked yet? If I've been sacked, I've got all day. No, we're okay. So
that's great news. Well, we get a number of questions flowing in onto my iPad. Maybe I can ask a couple of those first, and also see whether there are people in the room today who would like to ask the question. The first question is from John Paul Rathbone from the Financial Times, who listened to what you said about the problems we have in terms of stockpiles of weapons and ammunition and so on. And I think a frank acknowledgement that we have an issue there, but asks what is happening now to address that in the relatively short term. So you've recognized the problem, but what is being done to address it?
So we have spewed out letters of comfort to industry at a pretty quick rate to be very clear that we have revised the level of stockpiles that we think it is prudent to hold, and that we need them to be building production lines very, very quickly indeed, in order to service that demand. And the money is available because everything we've given to Ukraine is new for all. So the sort of replacement of what we've given to Ukraine, easy. Prioritizing within the defense budget, the growth of our stockpiles thereafter is a case that didn't need to be made internally. Ben and I revel in the idea that we might produce the world's most boring refresh of the IR that you can imagine. Like, we absolutely love the idea that it is the bits of defense that you've never heard of that get the investment, because all informed commentators know that that's where the risk has habitually been taken, because nobody ever looks at it. Nobody holds you to account in Parliament about the capacity of your strategic ro-ro fleet, your ferry fleet. Nobody holds you to account in Cabinet about the bandwidth of your satellite system and how many concurrent points of presence you can maintain at any one time. So actually delivering the world's most boring IR that the Sun are hopping up and down about, obviously, but the kind of wider thing about where are the tanks, we revel in the idea that what we deliver is forces that are genuinely deployable, resilient, quickly usable, and most importantly of all, sustainably lethal. And so that's what we will do. We will reprioritize to make a priority of the unsexy bits, including the stockpiles. And I should also add into that there is also a reality about where we source from Ukraine for. So I think what we're really doing is looking for industrial partnerships where we can co-invest in existing manufacturing capacity elsewhere in order to increase that capacity to supply Ukraine, knowing full well that when production lines come into service in the UK, and we are pushing Thales and BAE and others to get them into service quickly here, that they are going to be needed to develop our own stockpiles so that conventional deterrence is restored.
Well, I think many defence experts will be reassured by your commitment to a boring IR. There's a lot of excitement in the past, but I mean, certainly personally, I think you're absolutely right on that. We have another question here, if I may, which really relates to what you were saying about the war of the narratives and some of the early successes I think the Alliance had. And Toby Lewis asks, releasing intelligence in such a public way almost carries a high degree of risk, notably around the security of the sourcing. What's the threshold for taking on that risk, and under what circumstances would we look to do this in the future?
Impossible to say, because I mean, that intelligence back in January that was really starting, and the speed it went from Strat 3 to Washington Post, that was an incredibly sensitive source. But such were the stakes that the US, and I don't know exactly whether it was a sort of technical or human sourcing, that's the NSA's and the CIA's business, not mine. But I just know that I read it in a kind of super secret, minister, don't you dare read this, and then it's staying in this room. But what was at stake back then was a country trying to create the pretext for a full-on invasion into another, with 140,000 troops around it, all the Iskander missiles. I mean, it looked like it could have been absolute carnage. And if the Russian war machine had got going in the way that I think the Russians had intended to, it would have been shock and awe on an amazing scale. It was through incompetence and a failure to read the weather and a misunderstanding of how the Ukrainians would react that didn't happen. But the US made what I think will be regarded in history as an extraordinarily brave and sound decision to declassify that intelligence and get ahead of what could have been a really insidious false flag otherwise. And you know what? I mean, we haven't needed to call out the kind of false flag of this nuclear dirty bomb thing, because that is just transparently a lie. And you don't need to declassify an intelligence to show that. But I think you've got to be willing, the risk has to match the reward, and that is a decision for the people who own the intelligence in the first place, which invariably, given the sophistication of their networks, is the US.
Very good. Thank you very much, Minister. Are there questions then from the floor? Please, and please introduce yourself.
Thank you, Minister. I'm Sean Monahan, a visiting fellow at CSIS. Thank you for your remarks, terrific remarks. Number one, you mentioned conventional deterrence is back, a very welcome message. How might that translate into the refresh you mentioned of the integrated review? And you could talk about the exciting bits as well as the boring bits. Second point, if I may, a subject of discussion in this trilateral dialogue, which is focused on northern security, has been the emergence of the JEF, the Joint Expeditionary Force. I wonder if you could say a word about the JEF.
Definitely. So on the right IR refresh, I mean, genuinely, I don't want to be drawn on the sexy bits. I mean, I think the stuff that we might do to protect underwater CNI or whatever, that's kind of really necessary. It's a thing around hardening the homeland, being more resilient. But I would rather have the number of ships, number of tanks, number of planes that we've got right now, but know that every single one of them has got in their arsenal or their magazines or their ammo bunkers sufficient warfighting stocks with which to be in the fight every day, every night for as long as it takes, I'd rather know that we have the spares and the engineering capacity to sustain them in the fight every day, every night, for as long as it takes. I'd rather know that we have the people with the right qualifications to operate that kit every day, every night, for as long as it takes. I'd rather know that we have the strategic air and sea lift to resupply that stuff every day, every night, for as long as it takes, than I would want to see any sort of transformation of the force or growth of the force or whatever else. That has to be the priority. We have not had, since God knows when, a real focus on our ability to warfight. We've taken risk against it because we've been that counterinsurgency. We've taken risk against it because we can operate and deter. Now, that's not been in any previous IR. We've kind of, of course, we can reaggregate and we've still got what it takes. And there's been some assumptions made about the speed at which you can repurpose industry in order to come on stream. But the Ukraine experience has shown that to be incorrect. And that's why Ben and I are so determined to win the argument. I don't think it's an argument with the services. I think it's an argument with the sort of wider defense commentariat beyond those of you who really, really think about it. But the sort of casual observation is the only answer to an increased threat like the one we're facing right now is bigger. And actually, the initial answer is get what we've got properly working first. And then the other bit was about Jeff. Yeah, hugely important. I mean, not least because Jeff conferences are enormous fun because it's kind of beer drinking nations of Europe unite. But that sort of that preference for beer actually gives us a real common understanding. There is just a thing around how the Balts, the Scandinavians, the Danes, and us think, how we do our business, how we trust each other. And it just works. And we kind of have a view that NATO is a great thing. Article 5 is a great thing. And nothing about the Jeff must distract from that. But there's a whole set of challenges that one might face. Like, for example, when we had a Jeff conference in Helsinki the other year, and the sort of problem that we thought about was a challenge to undersea infrastructure in the Baltic. Well, that proved pretty timely. And just having that group of nations who share a geography, share a mindset, trust each other, want to work together, want to sort of be in a position where 2 of us, 3 of us, 10 of us can do something that responds to something that might not make the threshold for NATO, or where the NAC decision-making process might just need that there's something in the meantime that you could do to deter together or to get ahead of further escalation, just feels really valuable. Now, whether that's something that is replicated, I mean, there is a thing, I think, about minilateralism around the world at the moment, and forming little clubs of like-minded groups, and the interconnectedness of all those minilateral arrangements is quite interesting. But the Jeff is just something that emerged from, a sort of a what if, and has now become something that really excites heads of government and has huge utility, probably beyond defense. And it's just about common geography, common understanding, common instinct to work together.
Very good. Thank you, Minister. Please.
So thank you so much. Max Bergman at the Center for Strategic International Studies in Washington. Wanted to ask you about the defense industrial capacity challenges, because it's a challenge now for every NATO country, including the United States, of the problem that you identified. I think you hit it the nail on the head. So how do we as an alliance reduce some of the redundancies and sort of rebuild our conventional capacity together in a cooperative manner? It's very difficult for our industries to work together, but is there a path forward there where we can coordinate or cooperate on rebuilding capacity?
So I think there has to be, but there's quite a big US conversation about NOFOR and ITAR for that to be the case. But then there's also, but then there are also national considerations. So a really obvious thing to do, and I think people misunderstood some remarks I made somewhere around the world when I've been sort of spouting off about this stuff a few weeks ago, where I was sort of suggesting that that different countries might have different types of industry. So Germany has lots of automotive. So at time of big NATO war, Germany's doing all of the APCs. and France around Toulouse, and the UK, and has got lots of, and the US, lots of sort of civilian airliner construction, so they're doing the strategic model. I don't think that you can do a sort of global industrial strategy, because that won't match the kind of business as usual daily demands of your domestic economies and supply chains. So I think it's just, I think there is of course, the consequence of being in an alliance like NATO is that the sum must be greater than its parts, and therefore a degree of design around who focuses on what. Do the Germans and the Poles produce divisions that are designed to operate across big planes, and is that their thing, and they design a force and therefore an industry that delivers that? And are we thinking about something that's a bit more environmentally specialist with our friends in the north, with the Norwegians and the Swedes and the Finns, that is a bit more sort of thinking about how do we get through the cold and the woods in order to do the left flank? Don't know. So it could be that sort of NATO strategic design naturally leads different industries in certain directions. But the broader point that I would make is I think there's just a reality to confront that if you have offshored so much of your manufacturing and put it at the far end of what would be a highly contested sea line of communication, you probably have got yourself to a place where you don't have the industrial depth, the strategic depth to successfully prosecute a full-on war. And I think that forces you to consider the requirements for domestic manufacturing capacity. And that's an interesting challenge for government, because industry, and I don't mean defense industry, I mean just industry writ large, is of course going to make decisions about where it is most cost effective to manufacture. And the government needs actually to perhaps to create an incentive that just guarantees a degree of heavy industry to support the sort of effort that might be needed.
Any other questions?
Which you would think in Congress, everybody would be like, yes. I mean, it is a little bit. I don't think that the sort of reinvigoration of the Rust Belt was really about delivering strategic depth. It's about jobs in America. But there is a kind of thing that if you hollow out your industrial base, as we've done, as almost every developed Western country has done, your ability to respond in a moment of existential challenge is greatly reduced.
Very important. Peter, please.
Mr. Thank you. I'm Peter Jones. I'm a distinguished fellow here at RUSI.
Very distinguished.
Very distinguished. I wanted to go back to what you said about the battle of the narratives, and I completely agree with you about the perhaps surprising success of the Russian counter-narrative in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, for example. So two questions. One is, do you think we're doing any better now at landing that narrative, the correct narrative around the world? And secondly, that bigger struggle that you identified, the defense of liberal democracy, what would you see as the really compelling arguments that should be part of the narrative for that?
So I think we're doing marginally better. I mean, I thought it was really interesting. I had done, it was an itinerary designed to get my head around end of ATMIS, Somalia, kind of what's next. So I'd done Mogadishu, Nairobi, Kampala, Bujumbura, Burundi. We're all ATMIS contributors. But I had a conversation with the president of Uganda over a couple of hours, extraordinary experience. He was a fascinating guy, and the president of Burundi the following day, in which I just heard this thing that they had been speaking, and that President Ramaphosa had been calling around and saying, well, what do you make of it all? And and the president must have then explained to me that there was that the conversations are very different. They have, unapologetically, they have their own national interests at heart when they're thinking about how they as a community of African nations should be responding. And you just realize that the certainty that you have, they're not really arguing about that. They're just sort of overlaying it with a sort of, yeah, but. And I came back and okay, this is quite interesting. We need to be careful here. And then a couple of weeks later, Boris went to CHOGM and they all came back like, oh my gosh, like they couldn't believe in CHOGM that the conversations were as nuanced as they were in what we thought was a straight up good v bad, right v wrong thing. So that gave a bit of a shock, I think, across the bows that we needed to be better at communicating and recognizing that the P3 all have different levers to pull around the world, but that actually it's not just about the P3. There's a sort of group of regional leaders who regard themselves as the kind of power on their continent, the power in their region, and it's investing in them and how they see it is a really important strategy to winning the competition for narratives. As for that sort of wider challenge, I mean, the difficulty is that my last two trips, I was in Jamaica 3 weeks ago, and then over the last 2 weeks, I was in Uruguay, Chile, Peru, Colombia. And that's a very kind of China-focused thing down there. And what's really interesting is that you end up in a situation where some of these countries are looking to tool up with maritime security capabilities, offshore patrol vessels most notably. They're doing so to protect their EEZ. The ships that they find most attractive because of the price point and the finance offer that's available are Chinese. And yet the reason they're doing that in the first place is to counter Chinese illegal fishing in their EEZ. So it's a kind of self-licking lollipop where the Chinese are going into their EEZ, threatening their food security and taking huge amounts of value away from their economies. And the consequence is that these countries are looking at buying Chinese vessels to counter it. So we can have a conversation. I can turn up and say, hey, but what about your values? I'm here to tell you about liberty and democracy. And they get that. Like that, there's not, Jamaica is a liberal democratic country. So too is Uruguay, so is Chile, so is Peru, so is Colombia. They get it writ large. But what they need is kit quickly to respond to a maritime security threat. And if I haven't turned up with my checkbook and my finance offer, then my offer is less compelling. I think there is also a thing about the degree to which we understand those markets. So we've got to get out there, make the pitch, say that this is about values, say that if you work with us, if you buy American, buy British, buy French, buy Norwegian, the Norwegians will build you a seaport and you won't be ransomed in 5 years' time for your vote in the UN over a difficult issue, because we're building your seaport as a trusted partner that believes in your sovereignty. We believe in freedom, we believe in democracy. And that should be a great pitch, but I don't think we're good enough at getting out there. I don't think we're good enough at leveraging the power of Western finance, and how do Western governments de-risk Western financial investments into more challenging parts of the world as an alternative to just straight up Chinese state debt. I think all of these are the things that we've got to close with a matter of foreign policy. This is turning very quickly into a valedictory rampage for everybody's business. But I do think that's one of the key things, that making the argument alone over values, if it doesn't come with the benefits of being members of our club, we will find that we're up against it, because necessity requires, if you want to grow your economy, necessity requires you need the motorway. Necessity requires you need the railway. Necessity requires you need the seaport or the airport. The fact that that motorway, that railway, that seaport, that airport is also conveniently located to get rare earths out of the Congo and to the Indian Ocean, then out from the Indian Ocean and back to China, is neither here nor there, because there's a sort of symbiotic thing that it's good for their domestic economy and it's good for China. And we've got to come up with an alternative pitch.
Very good. This will be the penultimate question.
I'm Carsten Peace from the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. Thank you so much for sharing your reflections. I would like to perhaps try to challenge you on your assessment of the future of the war itself. Of course, you don't have a better crystal ball than the rest of us, I assume, but nonetheless, how do you see the war play out, both militarily on the ground and of course politically? What will be left in Russia afterwards?
So I think that we don't know. At every turn, things have gone better than we ever anticipated from the Ukrainian perspective and from our perspective as supporters of Ukraine. But you must never ever get carried away and assume that just because the defense of Kyiv was massively more successful than we'd ever hoped for, that the defense of every Ukrainian city will go as well as that. That the counterattack into Kherson and to Kharkiv and then sort of around has gone infinitely better than we could have ever hoped for. But that doesn't mean that every Ukrainian offensive will go well. So you constantly have to err on the cautious in terms of your analysis and then let the Ukrainians surprise you. So the cautious analysis is that the Ukrainians get to the Dnieper, and that is an extraordinary success. the cautious analysis is that they consolidate their gains up in Kharkiv and round into the Donbass, and then the winter comes. The strategic depth of both sides is tested to see how they can mount a limited operations whilst the ground is hard enough in midwinter. But really, it's about testing each other's strategic depth of how you are ready for spring offensives when the weather improves next year. And our effort, therefore, obviously, is focused on making sure that Ukraine has the greater strategic depth. And the extraordinary thing about the way that Putin and his team have mismanaged the whole situation is that every moment when the Western alliance might have fractured because energy prices were going to be really challenging, he goes and does something that makes everybody come back together. At the moment when everybody's going, oh my gosh, everybody's going into recession, this is a bit of a, this is all really challenging. He goes and talks about a radiological dirty bomb, everybody comes back together. So Putin keeps reinvigorating and revitalizing the Western alliance and reminding us why we're doing what we're doing. And that, extraordinarily mistimed to do the dirty bomb thing now, because everybody is going, we're facing real financial hardship, lots of difficult decisions to come, but we are still going to support Ukraine no matter what. Liz said it as she left. I bet you Rishi said it in his arrival speech on the steps just now. No matter how the midterms go, Congress will continue to say, support Ukraine, stand up for what's right. The French are committed, the EU is committed, Germany is committed, Turkey is committed. It just feels to me that, Russia has made the mistake of re-emboldening the Western alliance at such a point where strategic depth is needed to be ready for next year. If the Ukrainians surprise us and get it all done sooner, great, but there is a danger of catastrophic success, which we have to be careful about. But in all probability, it goes on next year and the year after, and we just need to keep with it until, this isn't about what happens in Russia. That's Russia's business. This is just about being clear, unequivocal in our commitment to be there for as long as it takes, standing behind Zelensky, so this ends on his terms.
Minister, I think that's a very good point at which to finish this session. Thank you so much for your generosity.
My pleasure.
In answering so many questions so clearly and in such an interesting fashion. I wish you luck in the hours to come.
So resignations and stuff have started happening, and so far, thank you all very much. Thank you. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you. That was great. Very good. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks. And now, ladies and gentlemen, straight on to the next session. And our panelists have been waiting, very patiently observing our minister. I have to say, especially for our foreign guests, we don't always have such interesting presentations from our ministers. Very often they arrive with the speech written by their officials and they read it, which is much less interesting than what we just heard. But I'm sure you're all very well able to follow that. So without further ado, Ambassador, I think you're first.
Okay, I'll go first. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me. I thought this was really interesting. I thought I should focus a bit actually on the first question, which sort of addresses the whole thing. How has Russia's invasion of Ukraine changed the transatlantic environment? Yes, well, in a way, Putin and they have achieved exactly the opposite of what, in a way, must have been. You shouldn't put yourself always in. You're not able to. You should put yourself in the shoes of others, but there will always be something that you miss. But it's hard not to come to the conclusion that in many ways you've achieved exactly the opposite. And you will excuse me, and I think it's my job as a Norway's representative to point out the one, for us, in a way, really, really overriding thing, which is that we are in a situation where we will get Sweden and Finland as members of NATO. Now, I started out as a Norwegian diplomat in 1984. And that was at the height of the Cold War. The first years of the 80s were actually very hard years, and during the Cold War, and I was brought up in a pretty rough, if you allow me the expression, pretty rough sort of security school how one dealt. There were some solid features to that. One of them being how you dealt with having at that point in time the Soviet Union as a neighbor, and so it was good in many ways. But the fact that Sweden and Finland on their way into NATO is an enormous is a change of the security environment in Northern Europe. Well, in the whole of Europe, that you could look at, like the minister, that you could look at some of the figures of this, because Sweden and Finland are really advanced societies, both industrially speaking, they're liberal democracies, they're well-functioning states, they're great neighbors to us. So for us, this is a dream come true in many ways. And now the question is, of course, how can one be helpful in that aspect? There are many one thing is the military and the technical integration, and then there's the political one. I'm sure this will be a success. It will run reasonably smooth, but everybody needs good neighbors and everybody needs friends. I'll come back to that towards the end. So Sweden and Finland, not only from a capacity perspective, but also from a political perspective. Of course, there was integration. Of course, there were all kinds of arrangement, but it is very different that they're actually members of NATO. That must have been, if you're thinking from Putin's perspective, that must have been a major blow. On this point, let me just make one assumption that we have seen going around, which is we're not in any way, that doesn't mean that we're looking for a kind of a Nordic or Northern European bloc in NATO. NATO is one organism, and we all sort of depend on each other. That is not the point. But of course, it opens up some perspectives, both bilaterally, where I think we have a huge potential now for developing our relations with both these countries. They're already our neighbors and very, very close. But nevertheless, after the events we've been through this year, and the fact that they're on their way into NATO really changes the whole landscape for us. But it will be done in the framework of NATO. The second one, and I'm not an expert on this one, but I can also read the figures, and that would be that, good heavens, if you take a look at the German, spending to come to reach the goal that Chancellor Olaf Scholz and the German government have set. It's an enormous increase. It's an enormous increase. I served many years in America, and I'm used to American figures when it comes to defense spending. So and then you get completely house blind. But in a European context, or also really in the global, so what the Germans are now committed to is huge, and just to absorb it will be a major thing. That must also have been, and that Putin achieved, to increase German spending, which to that extent, of course, is something that will also not only influence, but it will shape. Will shape the future of security relations in Europe. The figures are just too big to be ignored by anyone. The third perspective is on the politicals, and I'd be interested in some of the Americans in the room and others' view on this, is that what has this done to the US sort of engagement and focus on Europe? Now, I belong to a school, and having lived there for 10 years plus, the Americans really understand that the value in foreign policy of having friends. Someone told me once in the White House, there are only 3 rules in diplomacy and international relations. First one is know your friends. The second one is know your friends. And the third one is know your friends. And after the coffee break, you can deal with the other things. But to know your friends is it's absolutely the first the first rules. And the Americans sort of, they do get that on a normal day, and now in a way they're I wouldn't say forced, but of course the kind of conflict we're seeing at the moment in the Ukraine, if you have worked with the American military system or security apparatus a bit, and I probably can say that I have, that they will, their attention will be given. And then, of course, the next question after just finding out what is going on is where are our friends in this perspective? Where are our friends? So I'm actually pretty optimistic about where this has taken us. Now it has to be nourished, have to be looked after. These kind of relationships all relationships has to be looked after. But I'm not really afraid that you will see a major sort of American distraction from Europe because of Ukraine. It simply will in itself be a kind of a magnet. But yet we have to look after it in a way that that sort of brings friends even closer together. And the final sort of thing is, and the minister in his previous interventions alluded to this, is of course how the Ukrainians themselves rose up and are defending themselves, which is a separate and individual. One thing is that they receive help, arms, etc., but actually their sheer willingness to defend their territory is very, very impressive, and shows shows something which I think has over these months have left us all really impressed. And there's an element there which is a hats off if on their own, because they are carrying the main burden, the suffering of the people, etc. But the will sort of to fight on and to defend is really, really impressive. And we should remind each other of it all the time, because sometimes you lose your sort of, you get into all these strategic issues which are important in itself, but up at the bottom at the heart of this lies their righteous cause of defending their own territory. I think I'll stop there.
Ambassador, those are really profound contributions and points you've made, which I'm sure we'll pick up on in the discussion to come. Can I now turn to Rachel Elhouse, who's the senior civilian Pentagon representative to the US mission in NATO. Rachel, it's great to have you here and really interested in hearing what you have to say.
Sure. It's great to be here. And as you pointed out, I do sit in that US role, but I'm also the US Defense Advisor to NATO. So I've had the advantage of seeing this conflict and the evolution in the transatlantic security environment, both from a US perspective and a NATO perspective. So I'll focus my remarks on that, as well as, what can we expect from the future US role? And of course, the elephant in the room and the question that I get a lot of is how America and NATO are going to try to balance the need to be present in Europe and deal with the current war on Ukraine, while still, as your minister said, not losing perspective on that broader competition. And I think, we just had our national security strategy released a few weeks ago, and our national defense strategy will drop this week. And I think you'll see more of the same, that there will be this recognition that the US, as President Biden said at the outset, needs to stick with its allies and partners in Europe and be present in Europe in a very visible way. But at the same time, China does remain that long-term pacing challenge. So we do have to think about how that changes the nature of the transatlantic relationship. But maybe I'll just start with that transatlantic security environment, because I have seen this attempted rebalance to the Indo-Pacific twice now. The United States attempted to do this in the 2012 to 2013 framework as well. And then we had the first invasion of Ukraine in 2014. So a lot of these changes in the transatlantic security environment date back to that period. And I would argue that we've had significant improvements to conventional deterrence since 2014. And a lot of the things we put in place at that time really paid dividends when we had to respond this time. So the subset of countries, including the United Kingdom and the US and Poland and Denmark, who really gave that joint military assistance to Ukraine, and the US giving them javelins. Those are all things that put them in this position to defend themselves so robustly. Things like the enhanced forward presence. That was a forward presence of framework nation countries with pre-positioned equipment that the US and other nations could fall in on to have that very rapid reinforcement to signal deterrence and defense of the alliance. But it was still a shock. I arrived in the job on the 14th of February and sort of saw that evolution where a lot of the nations around the table just had their worldview overturned and just never thought in their wildest dreams, as you said, you never thought Sweden and Finland would become members of the alliance. This willingness to change borders by force was just incomprehensible for a lot of people around the table. And they're still coming to terms with the fact there is a major war in Europe. There is a slow evolution going on. Our Eastern allies try to tell us that they told us so, and they are really pushing on the conventional side to move from deterrence by punishment to deterrence by denial. They don't even want us to say the word deterrence. They said we need to move to defensive posture, and we have to build in the conventional sense on those 8 battle groups that have been pushed forward. But I do think it goes beyond that. There's work to do in other areas as well to complete this transformation of responding to the new security environment. I think we need to increase the credibility of the nuclear deterrent, given some of the things that Russia has postured with in recent days. Now, that doesn't mean getting into an escalation spiral with Russia, but it does mean modernization of extended deterrence and the nuclear deterrence allocated to NATO. It means better planning between the conventional and nuclear sides. It means more exercises, and possibly even thinking about broadening participation in that cooperative framework. We've talked a lot about resilience here, and I think this is something that NATO had been plugging along with, thinking about in its scenarios what the alliance would do if there was, a vulnerability around energy or critical infrastructure, with sea lines of communication being the most important one. But again, it's something that's very latent because we've been focusing on the conventional aspects since 2014. There's a whole subset of capabilities, which I would call strategic capabilities. This morning, we had a conversation about how, with Russia's conventional forces severely deteriorated, there'll be possibly a greater reliance on their nuclear capabilities, but also on standoff strike and hybrid. And I don't think I think this is something that the alliance is working at. We're really trying to get in this space, which the US calls integrated deterrence, which is thinking through how all of those tools can be brought to bear to manage escalation and create this deterrent and defense effect. But it's a slow evolution, but I'd argue that started since 2014 and accelerated since the 24th of February, but it's something that NATO was already doing anyway. So there's a good framework that can nest in. And now, since the Madrid summit, we also have the funding to meet that level of ambition through an increase in common funding, and then a number of nations already stepping up beyond the 2% benchmark. What we do lack a little bit is a new Russia strategy. NATO has really not changed its strategy towards Russia from what was laid out in the Harmel report, which is this balance between deterrence and defense and dialogue. But a lot of countries within the alliance are questioning whether that needs to take on a new approach. You've taken these very operational and tactical adjustments to the alliance, but what about the overall strategy? Right now, I think there's a hook there in the strategic concept, which no longer talks about Russia as a cooperative partner, but as the most acute near-term threat, mirroring the language in the U.S. strategy. But I think there's some work to do there as well. In terms of changes to U.S. strategy and posture within that framework that I just laid out, your minister pointed to the indications and warnings. I think that is something that is so important, but it really can't just always be the United States and the United Kingdom. We need to have other allies and partners around the table, keeping an eye on what's going on in the Baltic Sea, in the North Atlantic, the High North, and really passing that information on to the alliance, because that is what gave us the space this time to respond so effectively. If we hadn't had those indications and warnings, we could not have prepared. So I think the US will continue to partner with European nations in that regard. I think there is an expectation that Europeans step up, both in 2014 and in this crisis. There was initial first move by the United States. We put forward a presence in advance of the NATO enhanced forward presence coming in. We put forward, we surged a 5th BCT to Europe in advance of the 8 battle groups being stood up. So in a way that those became seed corn for the NATO and European presence. And I think going forward, if we look at potential changes to US strategy and posture, particularly with the demands of the Indo-Pacific, you are going to need Europeans to take over some of the tasks that the US took on initially. And I think we see something very positive. I mean, whether it's in terms of bolstering deterrence and defense, implementing sanctions, or assisting Ukraine, Europeans have stepped up across the board, buying the right capabilities that we've talked about for decades, air defense and, MLRS, all of these things that we've had difficulty getting allies to step up and put into their own national inventories are now front and center. But I'd be misleading you if I didn't say that again, the NDS and the NSS still prioritize China as that long-term pacing challenge. And so what does that mean? I think on the one hand, there is this recognition that the outcome of the Ukraine war has an impact on China's behavior in the Pacific. And so that in itself is a driver for the US staying engaged for, quote, as we say, as long as it takes, and to defend every inch of NATO territory. I do think there's real meaning in that, and a recognition that if we don't persevere in this current conflict, that it actually makes it harder to keep a handle on the situation in the Indo-Pacific. And there was just actually a really interesting study from the Chicago Council on US public opinion, which I had to read it twice because I was so shocked. I mean, now 70% of the US public support continued assistance to Ukraine, and well over 60-70% want more US investments in NATO and US basing in Europe. Now, admittedly, we have elements on both sides of the right and the left in the US pushing against that, but I think there's a coherent center that understands the relationship between the European theater and the Indo-Pacific theater. And then I think, the final thing that I'll just say is within NATO, we've also started to take a more global approach. NATO doesn't have a China strategy, but NATO's strategic concept does talk about the challenge China presents, particularly in Europe, and talks about lines of effort around resilience, countering disinformation, even a little bit of assistance to the European Union and nations as they try to establish export controls or vet foreign direct investment screening. NATO is not the expert in that last line of effort, but certainly, I guess we can take the investment in the ports as a point of departure, and the question over Hamburg and whether allowing COSCO to have a significant stake in that is a good idea. That is something where NATO could talk about, well, that's a port that we use for reception or onward movement, and so therefore it's a risk, but possibly not. But putting that defense and security lens on foreign direct investment is another area where I see a little bit of growth in NATO's approach towards China. And then finally, I think the Ukraine crisis has also created a global coalition. So I said I wear this US hat and this NATO hat. In the US hat, I attend something called the Ukraine Defense Contact Group, which is led by the Secretary of Defense. And that is not a NATO-led body. In fact, that coalition is much broader than NATO. So we have Japan, South Korea, Middle Eastern partners sitting around the table. I think we had Colombia last time. But that's really important because the same way that that global coalition is stepping up to enforce the sanctions and help Ukraine, there will be a similar expectation that if something happens with regard to Taiwan, that those same countries are stepping up to assist in a similar way. So even if the Indo-Pacific seems quite distant and not necessarily immediately relevant for a number of allies and partners, I think the current crisis has taught us that there is that connection, as many of the speakers have laid out, in stepping up to maintain that order that we cherish so dearly.
Rachel, thank you very much indeed. Lots of other really interesting questions put on the agenda, both from a NATO and an American perspective. So that's very helpful indeed. So the final speaker we have is Matthew Ball, who's the director Euro-Atlantic in the FCG. I think, Matthew, you've only been in the post for a relatively short period.
Yeah, 4 weeks.
So 4 weeks of time.
Yeah, don't
So,
expect anything profound.
we are indeed expecting precisely that. So over to you.
Brilliant. Folks, thank you, and thank you for the invitation to this event. It's been fascinating as ever, and my thanks to kind of the panelists, to Malcolm and to Peter and the team for including me in this. I wholeheartedly agree with what Rachel's just said, so I will try and be sort of blissfully brief and offer you just some reflections after kind of 4 weeks in this gig. So where to start? I think, firstly, what will I say? I think the crisis has, I think, reaffirmed that our deterrence posture and our unity are perhaps NATO's greatest strengths politically. The power back to the power of that kind of narrative, as well as the obvious power of the capability. Both continue to hold, and frankly, then some right now. But of course, I think we would all agree, major tests await. But, and as we've already mentioned in this, the accession of Sweden and Finland, what is resulting from this egregious, horrific invasion of Ukraine? Well, Putin's getting a lot more NATO now, including a much longer border with the alliance, and as well as then the obvious, tangible, credible experience, knowledge, capabilities that Sweden and Finland will bring, and already do bring their association, but probably will bring as allies. And no ally more than the UK kind of welcomes them more than we do. I think a second reflection is around this whole issue of deterrence, and if we just go back to kind of January and February, did it work? The answer is obvious. Why didn't it work? We might want to kind of try and tease out at some point. 3 possible conclusions I would offer. Either Putin didn't believe us, he didn't care, or Ukraine was simply too important. But I think it leads us to re-examine, rediscover, refresh, and we're all talking about refreshes this morning, I know we are, is how I think we go about the need to develop what Rachel was also talking about, the need for a kind of more evolved concept of an integrated approach to deterrence, as Rachel's described it. How we deter potential adversaries by showing them in advance that we will deny them the potential benefits of their aggression. We need, I think, we need more people, and this is kind of happening in our system, to be incorporating deterrence thinking into their work and be able to communicate that thinking. There's a related issue, I think, also to do with nuclear deterrence. We need to reflect on Russia's aggressive signaling and rhetoric. It's not necessarily been a surprise, and indeed it's been built into NATO exercising in recent years. But in Ukraine, through our response, I think we've shown that we'll not be deterred from acting in the face of nuclear threats. I think what this does, back to kind of this broader point on deterrence, I think it reinforces the case for an integrated approach to deterrence, founded on a comprehensive understanding, I think, of the security environment, including our adversaries' thresholds, behaviors, and perceptions. So that rediscovery, perhaps, of deterrence and its constructs. I think next, I think we probably need to continue to take a view on how far we are willing to go to mitigate the risk of further Russian aggression outside NATO's borders. The strategic concept, I think, again, reaffirms that and reaffirms our commitment to supporting the sovereignty and territorial integrity of aspirant NATO allies. And that, I think, will and must continue. And I think then there are sort of a bunch of points about, in effect, what we're headed into. Clearly, the arms control architecture looks pretty fragile. I think we are facing years of tension with Russia. We need to kind of find ways of navigating this difficult period for arms control. And we need to think about the balance that we strike as an alliance in managing, I think, strategic stability. It's already been mentioned, it was mentioned by the minister, it's been mentioned by this morning session, it's mentioned by Rachel. I think it also demonstrates again the necessity of US engagement in Europe. But I think this crisis also demonstrates, again, to Rachel's point, the need for Europeans to step up. But the how, the when, the where, the why is clear. But what does that begin to look like in material terms? There's an issue, I think, for me about resilience. I think it demonstrates the importance of a more joined up approach. Again, it's all been mentioned. This is nothing new, but how we actually give effect to a more joined up concept of deterrence, whether that's cyber, hybrid, but also energy, climate change, climate security, and also how in that palpable demonstration of kind of coalition action and unity, how we also can give purpose to undermining the resilience of those adversaries. And I think I came back from Brussels in the summer, but I was on the other side of the town, working with the EU. The role of economic levers in this regard, and particularly here, obviously sanctions and broader economic measures, the role they now play in our broader arsenal here. Perhaps some sort of points has been brought up already. The integrated review undergoing a refresh. I can't give you a scoop on what it's going to say. I'll leave that for others. But I think it was clear in its vision, and I think it called the big shifts right. NATO remains the bedrock of our security. We are re-energizing our sort of security alliances across Europe. That will continue. Any refresh may give sort of shifts of emphasis, but I think it remains kind of broadly the right strategy. But I think what we're obviously going to see borne out of some of the consequences of this conflict and the invasion is an increased focus on the security of economies, supply chains, access to critical minerals, raw materials, energy, food security. And those perhaps to this point that the minister made about the power of the narrative, how we understand others' interests, their equities, in why this conflict matters to them, perhaps also gives us the ability to think about the power of the narrative and how we reinforce this global coalition against the horrors of an adversary who is prepared to wreak both violence and violate so many international norms. And I think constructs, brilliant ones like the JEF, I think will continue. It's a vital, I think, component to our approach to security in Northern Europe. Again, as the minister said, it's not just the sort of the beer drinking countries in Northern Europe, but it is those fundamental issues about shared values, shared purpose, common focus, shared histories, and a desire to work together. And that minilateralism, that sort of coalition, I think, now is the time for those to kind of thicken and deepen. And I'm conscious that they're going to, the JEF and other variants of it, will continue. Let me pause there because I'm sure I want to take questions.
Matthew, that's fantastic statement of where we are right now. Let me start then. We don't have to have everybody in the panel answering every question, but but feel free, any of you, to answer it if you wish to do so. The first question I have from Alex Walchester says, you mentioned SLOC, sea lines of communication. I think this was Rachel that mentioned this. How would you prioritize seabed warfare and protection in light of the alleged sabotage to the Nord Stream pipelines and what seems to have been the accidental damage to communication cables to the Shetland Islands? And I think I'd add to that the continuing discussion about the vulnerability of the gas pipelines from Norway to the UK and indeed to elsewhere. So anything you can say about how we protect, but also think about deterrence of such attacks would be most welcome. Rachel, would you like to
I guess
start?
that's me. Well, what we're finding in NATO after the pipeline explosions appears to be explosions, and it appears to be sabotage, is that a lot of critical infrastructure protection falls to nations. And so particularly in that scenario where the explosion occurred outside of territorial waters, there was no attribution. It was a mix. The assets were a mix of countries owning those assets. A lot of it was privately owned. So nobody was coming in and banging on the door for Article 5 response, or even an Article 5 investigation or Article 4 investigation into what had happened. But it did raise awareness about the importance of non-defense assets, whether it's energy, it's communications infrastructure, electricity grids, and just reminded the alliance that in this hybrid space, those are things that also need to be protected and deterred against threats to. So some of the things that are on the table is, sharing of intelligence and just keeping a closer eye on things that we know are vulnerabilities, mapping those vulnerabilities. So again, some countries are not going to want to tell you where their, critical communications cables are, or a lot of the things on the seabed. But there is a way to do this where you can share information without having to have that level of detail that creates the sensitivity. So we have a good sense of, all right, if this electricity goes down, where's the redundancy that we could have some depth so that, yes, it's a blow, but it's not catastrophic. So sharing of intelligence, sharing of information, regular presence and patrols, and then creating that depth so that you have more than resilience, you really have survivability.
Very good. Thank you. Ambassador, please.
Just one little word on, yeah, I totally agree with sharing intelligence. You also need capacity. The US has capacity we need capacity. We have some, but these things one can, it's expensive and but it's very, very important. Some of it will be, of course, some of your national capacity will be on private hands. So a lot of it will be on private, and these small submarines that are remotely controlled, etc., that can control cables and pipelines, etc. But capacity in this field is absolutely crucial, and we have to think wider than just a narrow defense sector, where of course there will be some, but a lot of those that knows the most about what the situation is like on the seabed is actually private.
Absolutely.
And I think that plays to Rachel's point about collaboration. I think it's a new collaborative kind of architecture that's going to be required in order to both understand, deter, and perhaps even respond to attacks of this nature, because obviously they are critical, pipes and lines. We've got to find a way to deal with this sort of flank now. How do we treat it? How do we conceptualize it? But also, how do we create the capabilities and the capacities to address it?
Very good. Thank you all very much. Please, Neil.
Thanks. Neil Melvin from RUSI. Matthew mentioned the need to start thinking about relations with partners to the east. So we're thinking here presumably of Ukraine, Georgia, South Caucasus, Moldova. The war in Ukraine has made very clear that NATO does not want to put its troops in direct contact with Russia. So we've got a clear position there. The EU has indicated, on the other hand, that it is looking now at enlargement to some of these countries potentially, but up until now, EU enlargement has always gone hand in hand with NATO enlargement. So we've got a sort of disconnect between security and EU enlargement. How do we start to look at relations with those countries, looking beyond the Ukraine war, addressing their security, given that those are often going to be the places that are going to be most vulnerable to Russian interference, with the risk of destabilization, escalation, and overspill that may then, of course, affect NATO itself?
Matthew?
Such a good question. So kind of an answer, incomplete as it is, from my kind of last perch in Brussels. I think this plays back to sort of greater collaborative cooperation between NATO and the EU in terms of understanding each other's advantage in each other, the levers that each other has, and how we can almost sort of reconceptualize what security means and how we use those levers those available levers to best effect, including the power of kind of market integration and economic integration, as well as ultimately over time, collective defense and sort of alliance integration. And whilst those may move at different speeds, how do we think across sort of institutional architectural boundaries in terms of what security means and how we can also give effect to it? So I think it comes back to how do we now, not just in sort of solely in hard-edged defense, but also other elements that are integral to what security looks like.
Rachel, maybe to rephrase and sharpen further Neil's question, is it really conceivable to imagine a Ukraine as a full member of the European Union without having something very similar to an Article 5 Security Council?
A full member of NATO.
Or
Or
something
the
very
EU.
effectively.
You know, I mean, NATO is thinking a lot about this now, given the current crisis, because the standard talking point is that the door to NATO membership remains open, and we stand by the commitment made at Bucharest that Ukraine and Georgia will become members of the alliance one day. But as we've seen, there's vulnerability in that because they don't have security guarantees. So as they pursue NATO or EU membership, they become more vulnerable in a way, because we all know that's sort of the red line for the Russians in how they conceptualize the security environment. So I do still think there are ways. So to answer your question, I can't see, given what I know about the criteria for NATO and EU membership and what's going on with all of those countries right now. I can't see them becoming members, tomorrow. But are there concrete things that the alliance can do to reduce the risk to these very at-risk partners that get a little bit closer to membership? And some of that is the stuff that Matt laid out, tying them economically to Europe. But a lot of it is also defense related. I don't want to be, sound like an arms dealer here, but the fact that they would have equipment that is, not Soviet era, that's able to be interoperable with NATO capabilities, that there are exercises and training and periodic presence in their countries, that their officers are going through Western military institutions. Those are all things that do create societal resilience, but also military staying power if they are put in this situation that Ukraine has found itself in. But it's difficult to get it right. I acknowledge that the best solution would be membership, but unfortunately, we're just not in that position right now.
Very good. Other, please.
Thank you. I would like to actually respond, if I may, to the same question. First of all, I don't think the Russian red lines or security concerns when it comes to Ukraine is any value anymore. We don't recognize them. So in principle, I don't think it's, letting Ukraine become NATO member is kind of, it's a different ball game now. But but the practical result of us giving so much weapons is that they, by de facto, in practice, they're already NATO members, at least under some kind of US protection. You wouldn't say that publicly, officially, of course, but in practice, the material consequences of all the weapons we give is that Ukraine is actually part of our security architecture already. That will be my state. That will be my and again, it was one thing is the legal, political, official one. The other one is like the de facto one. What the actual military contribution leads us to. What that applies for the other smaller countries, Moldova and others, I don't know. But it is really different times. When this war is over, we will, you know, I think we'll be less concerned about the Russian concerns and you know, address this somewhat differently.
That's a very interesting remark. I mean, I just coming back to it from the chair, if I may, the United States and ourselves are all three countries are providing a lot of assistance to Ukraine, but we are not fighting Russia. We are not in a war with Russia, and we have been deterred from doing so for a variety of reasons, including Russian nuclear capabilities. So, if Ukraine were a member of NATO, then the expectation of all member states is that other members of NATO would come to their direct defense. They wouldn't simply provide weapons to Estonia. You would actually have American and British and Norwegian forces fighting alongside Estonia. So I think that there is still that critical difference with due respect. But are there any final remarks members of the panel would like to make? Because I'm conscious that we are scheduled to finish at 1:30, and for the people online, I think it's only fair that we do so. Fine. Richard. Matt, thank you. Well, thank you all very much indeed. It's been quite a long webinar, quite a long event, but I think it's been a really interesting event. The Minister got us off to, I think, a very lively start, full of content on what will be an eventful day, I suspect, for British politics. And then our three panelists followed that act admirably and clearly and set another whole other set of balls rolling, which in